People come on in. So thank you everybody who's getting in. We're going to give everybody a few minutes here to join for this fireside chat, talking about security, luck or framework. As we get ready to go, feel free in chat. A, make sure chat is to everyone instead of just host panelists, but B, tell us what you're most excited about to learn about today. We have two great panelists with me here today. I mean, I'm feeling for Becky Teal, so already I'm feeling a little bit like, a little imposter syndrome here, but we are getting people coming through. I'm starting to see numbers dropping in, slow down a little bit, but we'll give it there. So Lisa, Ozzy, yeah, what are you most excited to learn about in today's fireside chat? Please put that in the comments. How to tie a bow tie? We can totally do that. I mean, we could do it live, but like I'll get distracted. It does actually untie. It's real. Lisa knows that. She's seen me
Yes, I
tie it.
do.
Um, but I think we have a good number of people here. We'll start to go. So, Lisa and Ozzy, why don't best framework for HIPAA compliant infrastructure? Boy, I don't know if Lisa Mitchell knows anything about that.
No.
Is something. So, why don't we start a little intro? I'll quickly introduce myself. And then I'll throw it over to you, Lisa, and then over to Ozzy's. But so I'm Ethan Tancredi. I am a technical account manager at Huntress. I actually lead our technical account management team. I am sitting in for the great Becky Teal, who normally runs our fireside chats. She happens to be out at one of our roadshow events today in Orlando, apparently driving a tank as part of it. So if you don't know about Huntress Roadshow opportunities, take a look. There are some fun activities we do educating the community. But today we're talking about frameworks with security. And is it luck, or is it the framework? And Lisa, please introduce yourself, Lisa Mitchell.
Yes, my name is Lisa Mitchell, and I am the CEO of Progressive Computer Systems. We are based in North Carolina, and we've been in business for almost 40 years, which sounds like a lot of years. Very proud, but hard to say out loud. We are an MSP who specializes in managed services, high-end cybersecurity services, and then compliance as a service. And to give you an idea kind of how I'm involved in the community, I am part of ConnectWise peer group, the Evolve groups, and I'm part of the alumni board and the advisory board and a panelist often for ConnectWise. I am also part of a PE group. And for the last 5 years, I've been working with them to help get cyber insurance for everybody in our PE firm, and also setting up a common set of security tools and a security stack. So that's relevant for what we'll be talking about today. And then also doing risk assessments for the MSPs in our PE group and assessing where they are in their tool stack maturity. And then also I serve as facilitators for security councils and compliance councils. And made us a little bit unique as an MSP are one, we're an early adopter for HIPAA compliance. And then two is just our ability to do risk assessments for MSPs. And that's something that's, I think, a little unusual, and they're actually looking at what MSPs are doing for security and assessing them. So I'm very happy to be here today and looking forward to talking with you guys about security.
Yeah, excited to have you here. And,
Thank you.
Lisa, you definitely are a pioneer on that HIPAA and compliance side. I remember in Evolve days with you many years ago where you were talking about this and the importance of it. So excited to hear your wisdom on it. Ozzy, you want to introduce yourself to the everybody and kind of the journey and how you got to the point where you're at?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name's Ozzy Saeed. Thank you, Huntress and Ethan and team, for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure. I am the founder and CEO of IntelliGRC. We are a SaaS-based GRC product vendor with some professional services specifically for service providers and operationalizing GRC services. My background mostly started in my career in engineering, systems engineering, network engineering in the DoD space. So I've done a lot of work at the Pentagon, Fort Belvoir, Fort Bragg, et cetera. And then I want to say halfway through my career journey, I started pivoting into more of the compliance side of the house. So at that time, the term was information assurance rather than cyber compliance, right? And at that time, it was a migration of the federal government systems going through DIACAP to NIST RMF. And then we started working on things like FedRAMP and so on and so forth. I started to use a ton of GRC tools when I got into the compliance space, and I just felt like it wasn't as accessible without like expensive consultants or, premium dollar tags tied to a tool or the services, professional services out there. And so I kind of set out on a mission to say, how can I make cyber compliance more accessible to the masses? And the analogy I like to give is like, safety should be built into our ecosystem, no matter what ecosystem that is. And kind of like one of the jokes I say is you don't pay upgrade premium for a seatbelt in a car, right? So it should be given to you, and information technology is no different. So I started actually developing our product in 2016, and we launched it in 2022. But I'm excited to be here, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Oh, very excited. And yeah, that analogy with the cars is so accurate, right? Of like where we are. But it's also an interesting analogy. Good buddy of mine in the space, Matt Lee, talks about how, like, if you look at the safety of cars, it took a long time before we started getting seatbelts. And so I think we are in that kind of same progression from a technology, computer information side of getting those basic safety things built in place. So let's talk a little bit. Lisa, we'll start with you and then maybe kick it over to Ozzy. But like, how did, for security specifically, when did you start that movement of saying, all right, we need a more robust security offering? Was it, when did you say, okay, was it, there's kind of a cart or horse issue there, right? Did you start, because your clients were coming to you with this, or were you seeing trends that you're like, we need to get ahead of this?
Yeah, we started our security journey back when HIPAA started really getting teeth with the omnibus rule around the 2013 timeframe. What we found was we had to be HIPAA compliant as a business associate. We were confused why our clients were not becoming HIPAA compliant. Quickly learned that they just didn't understand how to do it. So when we had to go through HIPAA compliance as a business associate, we made the decision to go ahead and just productize that and provide that offering to our clients to make sure that they're HIPAA compliant. And what that brought alongside with compliance is also the need for cybersecurity. So there are a number of pieces within the HIPAA framework that require security, tools. And so that's really when we started our journey with cybersecurity.
Yep. And Ozzy, kind of same thing. Like, what pivoted you? You went from a framework, right? But that security specifically, how did that play out for you?
Yeah, sure. So I think when I was moving from engineering to compliance related work, I became fascinated with how regulations influenced industry, right? And so I kind of just got into being a nerd and reading regulatory requirements on the weekends, right? And then just diving deeper into like, okay, these regulations are pointing to things like standards and frameworks. And these are good best practices. Ultimately, most of them, everyone can probably say are best practices. And so I want to say in 2015, when the DoD started rolling out DFARS 7012 for what became the predecessor of CMMC, I saw this impacting the defense industrial base, which is critical to the nation's security. And I fell in love with the story, right? I said, how do we protect our intellectual property? And it comes down to the supply chain, right? And so I got heavily involved with the DoD, had the opportunity to sit with the DoD CIO. There was other parties involved as well, like John Hopkins, Carnegie Mellon, in authoring the CMMC 2.0 assessment guides and scoping guides. I wanted to get involved from the perspective of small businesses because I felt that was crucial for our nation's like advantageous success, the economy, et cetera. And I grew up in Northern Virginia, and that's the majority of our industry and our economy is defense based.
Yep. No, definitely. So talking about that, what are some of the common pitfalls for those small businesses in developing those modern cybersecurity strategies you're seeing, both, maybe it's both at the service provider, but also for their clients. What are some of those?
Yeah, sure. So I've noticed that SMBs will typically be very cross-matrix, cross-functional teams, right? Naturally, in most small businesses, right? You're the manager, you're the owner, you're the person that does the lower level stuff, right? And so often it usually comes down to cost, right? Cost is typically the main driver behind concerns of adopting security, right? And so I think that there's this natural ecosystem rolling out of the SMB community and the reliance to MSPs and other service providers for their success. And so I think what I'm noticing is, again, historically, you get like Gartner put out a study. It said, the national average of cybersecurity compliance consultants is $350 an hour retail. That's ridiculous, right? Small businesses can't afford that.
Right.
So I think we're going to see this path where more and more folks will jump into this, and hopefully more and more MSPs jump into this as a market opportunity, because the TAM is constantly growing. And that'll essentially start commoditizing compliance, right? Cyber compliance, and making it more accessible. We saw the same thing with any other industry that's, started off as a luxury and became a commodity at some point.
Yep. No. And Lisa, what's kind of some of those pitfalls you've seen, either trying to implement some of these modern cybersecurity strategies at your MSP or with your clients?
It is to figure out what are the right cybersecurity tools you should implement as an MSP. There are so many tools out there. A lot of us have just too many tools already. So exhaustion over tools, and trying to just understand which ones are the best tools for what you need to do for your clients. So one of the things that we do is we obviously try to go to the conferences. We try to make sure that we're talking to the vendors. We're trying to make sure that we're doing product demos. We try to make sure that we're going to the security conferences where there will be people who are doing similar work to what we're doing, try to talk to them, understand what tools they're using. And so really tool analysis can be the paralysis, because it's just so difficult to understand what the right tools are. And part of
Did Lisa freeze?
Huh?
Oh, you froze. At least for me, for a moment, you froze.
Oh,
But maybe
okay.
it was just me.
Yeah,
All
sorry.
right, no problem. But you were talking about that analysis paralysis with tools,
Yep.
and it causes chaos as well, right? And so, what are some things that maybe Ozzy you've seen to help drive your way through that analysis paralysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it typically starts off with, if you look at most of these compliance frameworks out there, especially the cybersecurity, information security frameworks, they're very data centric, right? So you could typically look at your customer base if you're a service provider, right? As well as looking at yourself as a service provider. What kind of data am I handling? What kind of data is my customers handling? And then using that as a way to point to some kind of framework or regulation, whether that be HIPAA, whether that be CMMC, et cetera. And at that point, you would want to probably look into a functionality that can help with crosswalking requirements, right? Controls, for example, and just starting off there with that as a framework in mind. And I always tell folks, it's everything in cyber compliance is very complex, right? It's very nuance driven. It gets down to the lower level details. That's why typically it's a full-time job, right? And so with that in mind, if you can put a framework together where you're sourcing different requirements and crosswalking them, that should be your starting point, in my opinion. That should then point to more explicit set of requirements for like your tooling, your personnel, how you do your processes and your business operations, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And like Lisa, I know you definitely have seen this. Not only you are very mature in how you approach this, because you came at this from a strategy aspect with your MSP, right? But do you want to talk about maybe some of the common pitfalls you've seen with your experience advising some of those other MSPs under the PE umbrella group that you work with, of like who's done it well, where they've struggled? I mean, I'm not asking you to name names, but
Okay, good, good.
no naming names, but like, what are some of those common things people could learn from? Because I saw in chat people are like, "Oh, what tools do you recommend?" But is that really the way to start with it?
Yeah, so I'm sorry if my feed, it said my feed has not been great, so I don't know what's going on. So sorry
That's fine.
about that. Hopefully that will stop. So, common pitfalls that we see are really spending enough time to do demos with vendors, understanding the pros and the cons of different tools. And we see a lot of MSPs start down the path with a tool and then they cancel that. And they don't necessarily pick up another tool to provide that service. Vulnerability scanning would be a prime example for that. Because there's so many different tools out there, it's difficult to try to really hone in on what the best tool is. And what I would suggest is, pick a vendor, invest in that vendor, go deep in that vendor, go to their conferences, talk with them, look at their roadmaps, and really make an investment in the partnership. And you'll be able to provide feedback for them of how they can change their product to make it better. But you really do have to make an investment in these tools. It's not something that you can continue to change them. It's too costly time-wise and expense-wise to do that. So really making that relationship with the vendor, I think is really important.
No,
But,
and
Ethan, if you don't mind, I was
yeah,
going to add to that one process that I fell in love with that I received from a prior company that I worked for. It was like CMMI oriented processes. And I think if you kind of going off of what Lisa just said, right? If you create, let's say, an example of a spreadsheet table, you have a list of criteria, right? And then give it a weight, right? A 1 through 5, 1 through 10. How important is that criteria? Like in the example Lisa mentioned, vuln scanning. Can we do credentialed scans and unauthenticated scans? All of those lower level details. And then you'll have your options at the top, right? Vendor 1, 2, and 3. And then you score them. And if you could calculate the sum, the total, you'll end up seeing who's the best winner. So that's a concept that I fell in love with. So that's a tip there that I would recommend.
yeah, no, definitely. And also, I know when we were preparing for this talk, you were also talking about how a WISP can really be key in driving this. You want to talk about that as well for people who maybe are unfamiliar what a WISP is and how to leverage that to kind of get out of some of this chaos as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So ISO kind of coined a concept called WISP, and it stands for Written Information Security Program. And ultimately, there is some nuances and strategies there from a governance documentation perspective. But I always try to recommend to our customers and partners, let's not boil the ocean, right? If we look at policies, right, they're typically influenced by some regulation or framework, right? So if you look like NIST frameworks, they have really nice groupings of these domains and families, access control versus configuration management. You can create a policy around those domains, and ultimately, the policy should be very high level mandates. They shouldn't get so explicit and detailed enough that you have to constantly go back and update it, right? They should be mandates, high level. And the example or the analogy that I like to use is drive the speed limit as a mandate, right? Whereas if you want your policy to point to more explicit things like a baseline configuration document or a procedure document, then you would essentially say this road is 45 miles per hour, that road is 25 miles per hour, right? That kind of then ties it all together. And I like to tell folks, use something like a RACI chart or a RACI chart, right? Define the roles that are accountable, responsible, consulted or informed for those different sections in your policies. And ultimately, don't make it like a huge documentation nightmare. Only distribute the documents of the policy mandates to folks that have a responsibility or accountability of conformity. And then I like to take elements out of that are more user-centric facing, where think of a shared responsibility between the IT or InfoSec folks and the general end user population in an organization, and put that into something like an acceptable use policy or rules of behavior document or employee handbook, whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, your end users don't need to know how often vulnerability scans need to happen or the remediation timelines. What they should probably be aware of is what they need to potentially conform to, like make sure you're using the VPN when you're at Starbucks, right? Stuff like that.
Right.
So I always try to tell folks, keep it simple, right? Let's make this readable, digestible, otherwise it's useless.
No. And so what I'm hearing from both you and Lisa and comments in the chat is that, you build a strong foundation with a framework, right? That starts to drive some of this. So let's drop a poll about, where is everybody in the audience with their framework journey? So Linus, who I know is on the back end, is going to push this up and love everybody to kind of put this in here. Are you feeling great? You picked a framework, you're sticking with it. Are you just getting started? You have a ways to go, and you haven't really committed to any framework, and you're here to learn where to start. And so, please, take a moment, fill out that framework. We'll give everybody a second. Hopefully, you're not D, which we didn't put in, which would be like, I'm changing my framework every few months because I just read or heard a latest podcast or read the latest review on it. Because that, I will tell you right there, is the worst way to do it, of changing directions all the time.
Yeah, and Ethan, in the chat, there are
Yeah.
a couple of good things that we can call out. One is Jennifer, mentioned pick a framework, stick to it. That's going to control your processes and procedures. And Rob added a little bit there. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. That's where we're headed, because that's a great suggestion, Jennifer. And then also Jean put in a great list here, kind of top 12 tool list, which is one of the things that people had asked. That list looks very comprehensive and looks good. So thanks, Jean, for putting that in. That looks like some good information for people to take a look at. Yeah.
And I'll just read that list in case somebody's watching this and they're not able to see the chat in the future. That tool list includes RMM, EDR/MXDR, endpoint security, email protection, PSA, documentation, my favorite. Nobody loves it, but it's the key thing to make things successful. Vulnerability scanner, pen testing, cybersecurity insurance, end user awareness training. End users are totally a key part of any of cybersecurity and framework discussions. Compliance management, and then access control and password management. So yeah, Gene, super list. Appreciate it. Okay, here are the results. So we're actually a pretty mixed audience here. Just over a third, feeling great. They have a framework, sticking with it. Some are just in that journey, and some are like, no, this is why I'm here. I'm here to listen to experts. So thank you for joining, because you got some great people to learn from right here on the list. So let's talk about maybe, Lisa, I know you're really focused on HIPAA, that's your client base, but talk to you about how you all utilize. And HIPAA is such a nebulous term, right? Like like you can say HIPAA and people think that there's something there, but it is not clear cut by any stretch of the imagination. Tell us about how that journey of using HIPAA to work on your framework, went for you, and what people could maybe learn from you about it.
Sure. Yeah. So, like I mentioned, in about 2013, when the omnibus rule came out, what we started doing is we started offering HIPAA compliance as a service. And that allows us to be able to spend enough time with clients to set up monthly goals, quarterly goals, annual goals. And we kind of walk them through with bite-sized objectives. We have accountability meetings with them to make sure that they're getting there. But our real goal with that is first to get them compliant. And we're looking at things like policies. We're looking at plans like business continuity plans, DR plans, incident response plans. We're looking at security awareness training. We're looking at ongoing security awareness. How can we educate their staff beyond just doing things like phishing or annual security training? And then we also do automated tools that perform the assessments that you need to do as far as like HIPAA assessments and security assessments. But we really want to get them, first compliant, and then it really becomes another journey of maintaining compliance for them. And then The third piece is being able to illustrate compliance. So if they were to be audited by OCR or they were to have a ransomware or something like that, what we want to be able to do is illustrate how much work is being done, show the intent to continue to try to strive towards meeting all of the HIPAA requirements. So all of that led to us tagging compliance requirements along with security requirements. And then it was also helpful that a lot of the cyber insurance companies are starting to come alongside and require things like MDR. That made it easy for us to convince clients that they needed to have that level of security in place.
Yeah. And what you're talking about is you're talking looking at the rules and regs that are talked about in HIPAA and then basically finding controls and tools to match to them is
Exactly.
the key part. Like you can't, and I think the other thing you did, and you were great about this of coaching us in the peer groups, was encouraging everybody, take it slowly. It's not, it is a marathon journey, I think is what you told me back in the day. Like you need to set that expectation with your clients and your staff that this is not something you're going to knock out in a week, right? Like
Right.
it is something that you need to be doing some preparation work for it, and then you need to do the continual work.
Correct.
Yeah.
And the real challenge begins after you get them to meet the requirements to try to understand that they have to still continue every year to do those things. And then there are new requirements that are coming out that they also have to meet. So just educating your clients before you start working with them on those things works.
Yeah, exactly. And Ozzy, what kind of inputs do you have on framework, especially around the CMMC and the contracting work that you are so involved in? What would be some advice around there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I typically, going back to just choosing a framework, again, focus on the data and what is the data you're handling on behalf of your customers, as well as yourself, right? And so, for example, you can almost always point to certain types of data that a framework can be related to. So PHI for HIPAA, right? CUI for CMMC, right? SOC 2 is more oriented about services and protecting that service that you're providing, right? And providing some confidence with that service, and so on and so forth. So typically, I always tell folks that, unfortunately, most of these regulatory requirements and frameworks are super high level and subjective, right? And then you end up with this constant analysis paralysis of there's 1,000 ways to skin that cat for each and everything, right? And so I tell folks, well, I think the most important piece, which to me needs to be the most the hardest upfront work that you have to do, is scoping, right? And so we always try to educate the strategy of scoping from our perspective, which is basically identify the data. Let's not get into the analysis paralysis of specifics on that data. We can categorize it into something generalized, like, let's say, claims audit data for HIPAA, right? And so you could describe that and describe it in such a way that you can either spot it if you come across it, or you could touch it, or you could smell it, or you could feel it, right? Just try to describe it just enough. Once you have that, then understand the people, technology, and facilities, right? And I call those assets, right? People, technology, facilities that may be either storing, processing, or transmitting that data. And that's where you then look at your inventory of assets, right? Your people, your cloud services, your servers, your client computers, your endpoints, et cetera, and start drawing relationships with those data types you've identified. And that should give you a clear picture to say, okay, this is a technical control. I need to apply it to every endpoint, every computing device, BitLocker encryption, for example, right? That way you can quantify it easier, right? It's no longer this nebulous data at rest encryption. What am I doing, right? It's not a pass fail. It's 50 of my 100 laptops have BitLocker enabled, so I'm 50% of the way there, right?
Yep.
And you could kind of take the same analogy with other things like training, right? You could say how many of the people in scope have completed their training, right? And so on and so forth. So I'm a big fan of putting a lot of emphasis of scoping up front and center.
And then kind of, and either one of you can jump in on this. Rob made the comment that I love, which was mean any of the frameworks is not an IT project, but it's a cultural project with a heavy IT component. And where that gets me is how, that strategy and the role of leadership of communicating that and making an effective strategy, what are techniques you found to enroll those leaders to make what I'll call security aware cultures or help drive that? What have been successful techniques that either of you have seen that you want to share?
Lisa, do you want to start?
Okay, I'll start. So for us, a lot of it is really around educating, taking the time to educate the client. And you have to be very careful not to fear monger when you're doing this, and make sure that they understand what the requirements are, how they meet the requirements, what happens if they potentially don't meet the requirements. And it's really a risk conversation of what they're willing to, assume and not. And so for us, it starts around educating the client, and we spend months doing that for our client before they buy services for us. And trying to talk to them about what penalties look like, and those type of things, and then assuring them that this is a process we're going to come alongside of them and work through. This isn't something we're just going to educate them and leave them. So because we do compliance as a service and we're meeting with them throughout the whole year, we can educate them all throughout the year, and update them on what's happening and changes and those types of things. But it's really about education, and then you got to determine what their risk appetite looks like.
That risk appetite is key. Ozzy, I'm sure you can talk about that as well. Do you want to talk about how you make people aware of risk, right? Because there's educating them. It's easy to try and show them the risk, but how do you make them feel the risk, I guess? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I completely second what Lisa just said. Fear mongering is the wrong way to convince people, right? In fact, natural human behavior is we'll push it away further if you try to scare me about it, right? So I think the right approach is going to come down to, if you have frameworks that are voluntary in nature to a degree, or even if it's a regulated framework like HIPAA, but there's no third-party validation, right? So some folks will say, there's no HIPAA certification. I'm doing what I think is right, and that's good enough, and that's fine, right? But what you should be concerned about is what could happen if things go wrong, right? That's your focus. We're not talking about what good looks like. We're talking about what if something went wrong, right? And so that, to me, is how you can convey risk to leadership. Now, granted, I think that industry is starting to move in the direction of more and more third-party validations. With things like CMMC, it started off as a self-attestation and then, quickly pivoted, right? HIPAA's going through a rewrite, and who knows? Let's see what comes out of it, right? And so people are starting to respect the third-party validation and accreditations more naturally. It gives an extra sense of security. But at the end of the day, if you just focus on if something went wrong, what could happen to my business, right? Because that's the most important thing at the end of the day. And I don't care what anybody says, but at the end of the day, the best protections you have in any sort of negligence is going to be your ability to demonstrate due care, due diligence, right? And hey, I did everything I was told to. I did the best I could. That's your best defense. And then your second best defense is your cyber liability insurance.
And Nathan, I'd add one more thing, is that, in order to be able to educate clients on risk and those types of things, in my opinion, you have to be more their strategic business partner. You have to be proactive with them. You can't just be a reactive MSP and then try to come in a role of educating clients. So you have to invest that time with them on the front end, make sure you've got that relationship so they know when you're coming to them with these kinds of suggestions, you're doing it in their best interest.
Yeah. And Jean's comment in chat, right, of that her strategy on the risk is ask them how much they can sustain to lose monetarily and socially, to open up that conversation, because it's easy. I know I felt this from the service provider side. It was easy to make an assumption. I knew what their risk was or what their risk appetite was. But once you actually start to have that conversation, you get, at least I think, from that strategic relationship you've already been building, right? You can now have that trust to say, hey, like, what is your risk? What are you willing to lose? How much are you, right? That becomes key.
I think one other thing I was going to add is it's also a marketing play, right? If you are able to demonstrate a mature security posture, right? That's a business advantage, right? You can grow because people are going to be able to look at you, and if you can offer them that transparency of look at what I'm doing to secure my services or your data or whatever it may be, that's a huge marketing opportunity, right? You can sell that, and so don't make it a negative. I think showing the losses and the negativity is one aspect, but I try to compensate equally with the positivity of what's the outcome if you do this. In CMMC, you get certified, more contract work, right? Things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's, Michael in chat said, what do you do when they push back on, oh, this is a cost? I think that you're right, Ozzy. You start to point, yeah, there are costs, but there's going to be benefits to their business in doing this as well. And you every business needs to make those adjustments of where they're going to invest those dollars. But if you can show them that there isn't just a cost, but there is a financial benefit to investing in these practices, then that might open that wallet up a little bit more. Lannis, I know we talked about, and I think it's been a great time about aligning your stack, right? So poll question for everybody is, how have you designed your tool stack? Have you picked tools that made sense? Because you're like, oh, vendor A told me this. Have you used a framework as a guide? Are you using cybersecurity insurance requirements? Is it customers' liabilities based on data handling needs? What's everybody kind of using for having designed their tool stack and figuring out what tools they are going to be using in their processes? And so we'll give everybody a moment or two to answer that in. But I think where I want to drive this conversation is that kind of guiding light of how to evaluate and align tools with a framework, and having that further conversation around it. Let's maybe pop the poll up if we have it finished, I would say at this point. So half the group has picked tools that made sense. Then about a quarter have used a framework as a guide. The others are, we're using cybersecurity insurance or customer liability data. So we have this kind of divergence here. And Lisa, I'll start with you about, how are you making those evaluations? You talked about being engaged with your vendors is important, not switching tools, monthly. I don't think you said monthly, but I know in our peer groups you and I were in, we had some people in those groups who changed tools every 6 months, potentially. And so how did you evaluate and align maybe and go? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time talking with vendors, looking at different products, trying to make sure we're using the best quality products that we're delivering for our clients. I go to a lot of conferences. I have kind of developed a security peer group that I talk with. I get feedback from them. We make decisions that way together. We also, through part of the PE group, we have a lot of security councils and those types of things. And then demoing the product, involving my technical team to try to get their input of what they think the advantages and disadvantages of different tools are. But ultimately, Jennifer's right. I picked a framework, I picked, NIST, and I aligned my tools to that. But also, there are things that clients come to me and I have to align the security tools based on what client needs are. And also, as I see the requirements in the cyber insurance industry changing, I've got to align to that as well. So I use really all three of those, but the most important thing that I choose is a framework, and then I stick to that, and then I just make sure that my policies and my procedures and my tools and the services that we're offering align to all of those.
Yeah. And Ozzy, what are maybe some insights you have around minimizing overlap, right? Or optimizing the resources? You talked a little bit about that spreadsheet. I think that's one way, but what are some other ways of doing that? Because nobody wants to pay for a bunch of tools at the end of the day, right? So talk about that a little bit of what you've seen successfully done.
Yeah, I think interoperability is a big criteria when you have a library of tools that are all trying to accomplish different aspects, but they all kind of support a security, program, right? So how interoperable is the vendor's products that you're looking at, right? Can you build integrations? Does it have an API? So those are some good drivers, right? And I also think that one thing we often tend to overlook when we're looking at vendors and different solutions is if you have a framework that you're trying to implement yourself or for your customers, what you should be also looking at is how well does that vendor, not just the product itself, but the vendor's organization align with the same level of security, right? If the product is providing security functionality, in theory, it is an indirect attack vector, right? It's a risk, right? If I can get into your phone scanner, I can see where you're weak to then exploit those weaknesses, right? So this is where I think third-party accreditations from vendors like your SOC 2 report and also just asking them for that level of transparency is going to be important, right? In the NIST and the CMMC world, what's gaining traction and popularity is the process called a customer responsibility matrix or a shared responsibility matrix, where the vendor's clearly delineating, if you use my product, I already take care of these things for you on the back end. However, there's a shared set of responsibilities that you either A, need to worry about on your end, or B, here's some instructions, go in the management settings and configure that, right, for a single sign-on. That's gaining popularity. I think that's the right direction for vendors to go, right?
Yep.
And also holding vendors, especially vendors in the security space, accountable, right? Accountable to meeting their own obligations that would align well with your obligations. I see that trend just growing and growing, and I think it's going to be an interesting world that we're moving into with that, right? And if you notice a vendor's not trying to be transparent, right, or they're like, oh, it's secret, I can't tell you, start raising your eyebrows and asking questions. Because if they are being transparent and they're willing to talk through you about how they're protecting their environments and their products, right? That's important. We need to ask those hard questions.
Yeah. And I see we're coming up on our kind of time that we're shooting for on here, but like I think a key part of this also that maybe gets missed in I think one of the key things is validation. So you have a framework, and how do you validate that the stack is working? And maybe people in the chat can put in some things they do to share knowledge about how they validate their stack is actually effective. It's it's getting the outcomes that are desired. But Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the techniques you all have used, and then we'll pivot over to Ozzy, but start with, what are you doing to like make sure that your stack is effective in doing what it's supposed to do?
Yeah, I like Chris's comment that notwithstanding the tool has to enable us to make a profit. That's important. And we also saw in chat that people were talking about pricing, weighs into what tools that people choose. For us, we do a full risk assessment. That's doing pen testing, that's doing vol scanning, that's checking, doing scans against M365, doing scans at your endpoint level. It is comparing, the cyber insurance requirements and filling those out, proactively of what do you have in place, what do you not have in place. We also do a matrix of our clients. How many of our clients have accepted the tools? How many have not accepted the tools? Those are a couple of things that we're doing to kind of verify the stack and make sure that we're getting it implemented across our client base, not just a few clients. Because for us, it's very important to ensure that our clients are adopting our stack and not being able to choose and not necessarily take out the tools that we need to be able to protect them. So that overall risk assessment is what we use to check, kind of how well our tool stack is working.
Yeah, definitely. And Ozzy, you have anything you want to add on top of that of, effective techniques you've seen or what you all advise people about?
Yeah, absolutely. So security questionnaires is one concept, right? Ask your vendors to fill out a questionnaire. Sometimes they're nebulous and not as productive or valuable. but it's helpful, right? Because it at least establishes that communication channel to say, tell me what you're doing about this, right? The other thing that I like to recommend folks is if it's a cloud-based product, you can't usually run a vuln scan or a pen test against it, right? It's usually not allowed, right? Typically.
Yeah.
So in those kind of circumstances, or even in on-prem solutions, I like to help folks come up with a concept of taking their framework controls and developing their own CRM, right? And if that vendor doesn't have one, ask them if they have one. If they don't have one, oftentimes you'll be able to take something like a SOC 2 report and start filling out the details of what are they doing on their end, what do I need to worry about on my end, and just write it out. Once you start doing that, you get a nice picture of where the risks lie, right? And kind of looking at it as an attack vector. I would also definitely recommend, the last recommendation I'd make is there's a ton of cool open source resources out there. MITRE has this beautiful framework called the Attack and the Defend framework. Those are amazing to look at, and evaluating your tools against those frameworks as well.
Yeah. And I mean, soon you'll use book, I'll give a shout out, and it's something on a Huntress page somewhere that we posted. We did actually a talk, fireside chat, with some partners about how they were using his tooling and his matrix with tools to also show those different layers and gaps. And so Andrew Zakali, I'll call out, specifically create up a spreadsheet to help people. That's something that is on the Huntress Hub somewhere. We can find that going through there. Those are some resources you should definitely be thinking about. I want to just take a moment and thank both of you for being here today, sharing your knowledge. In case you missed it, Linus did put in chat that this is being recorded. We'll be sending out a link to the recording to everybody who signed up. We also will have transcripts of this, so that's there. To engage with you all, if people have questions, hit you up via LinkedIn. Is that probably Ozzy and Lisa, those the best places to find you on in LinkedIn would be my guess? I mean, I'm throwing you on the open without asking you if that was okay beforehand, but yeah.
No, absolutely. LinkedIn or
Yep.
I'm an open book. I'll put my email in the chat because I am just obsessed with helping people. So don't tell my sales VP that, he'll smack me in the hand.
I just put mine in as well.
Super. Thank you very much. Here, I'll throw mine in case somebody wants to get a hold of me at Huntress. But thank you both for being here today. Thank you, the audience, for your comments in chat. That was really helpful to drive our conversations. Really appreciate it, and hope you got some good ideas of how you can leverage frameworks to get your security and get out of that, the whirl of chaos is what we really want. It is important, just start to take some steps. And it's that whole analogy of you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? Like that's what this is going towards. And as long as you're moving forward, that's the key success part. Thank you, everybody, and really appreciate you being here. Becky will be back next month, so we will talk to everybody later.